Good afternoon. I'm Roger Zak. I'm director of the Reagan Institute. Welcome. In 1982, while speaking to the British Parliament, President Reagan said, quote, "Democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating." The last few weeks have borne out the wisdom of these words, and one core component of the Reagan Institute's mission is to do our part in aiding along that cultivation. To that end, we host conversations like the one we have prepared for you today that take a hard look at what came before the current moment to learn what we can from the great leaders of our past so that we better tackle the problems of today and tomorrow. The start of a new presidential administration provides a perfect opportunity to pause for a moment and reflect on past inaugural addresses and the role they play in our history. Today's event grows out of our Presidential Principles and Beliefs series, a collection of essays analyzing some of President Reagan's most important and prominent speeches. I encourage all of you to read through a few of them on our website. There are some phenomenal reflections that have been published in a number of notable journals over the last few months. Today's event features two of our essay authors who wrote pieces examining President Reagan's inaugural addresses, both of which you should have received links to. With that, I will turn the conversation over to the editor of our Principles and Beliefs series and today's moderator, Tanku Faradarajan. Tanku?
Thanks, Roger. Thank you for the opportunity to have some fun with the words of the greatest presidential wordsmith we've had. I'm Tunku Varadarajan. I'm the editor of this series on President Reagan's speeches that are published online by the Reagan Institute. And it's my pleasure today to have with us two of the authors of essays in this series. David French, with the blue sweater, is a senior editor at the Dispatch and a columnist for Time. His most recent book is Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. David is also a lawyer and, wait for this, a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. David wrote an essay on Reagan's first inaugural address. And the author of the essay on the second inaugural address is Matthew Continetti. Matt is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the history of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. He's the founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon. I almost read that as bacon. And he's the author of two books on American politics. His articles and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and the National Review. And his history of the last 100 years of the American right is forthcoming from Basic Books. So I'll start with you, David, since you wrote about the first inaugural. I've read your essay and I recommend it to everyone. One of the things that struck me was its echoes today. It was delivered at a time of a kind of national gloom, darkness, if you like, which some might say resembles our present condition. How do you see that?
Yeah, I feel like the gloom in the moment in 1981 was less immediately acute. It was less acute than it was in this moment. We were not 14 days or soon to be 14 days removed from a direct attack on the Capitol building itself, but there was a long building gloom. And what I do in my essay is I take a look at the dozen years or so preceding this inaugural. And if you look at the dozen years preceding the inaugural, it really is a chronicle at that time of what a lot of people were thinking of as American decline, American despair. We were only about a year or so removed from Jimmy Carter's famous malaise speech, a speech that has somewhat been unfairly maligned a bit, but really did capture a spirit in the moment of sort of a deep pessimism about the United States. And in that moment, there was reason for pessimism. If you go back the 12, 13 years before, say to 1968, you had urban unrest that was at a level far beyond anything that we have seen. You had a lost conflict in Vietnam. You had the resignation of a president under the cloud of scandal. You had successive energy crises. You had a hostage crisis that with a horribly failed rescue attempt in the middle of the desert. It just went on and on and on and on. And there was also a lot of literature at that time of American decline. I remember I was only 12 years old when Reagan was sworn in. And I was just sort of becoming like the political nerd that I would sort of really grow to be in middle school and high school. But I can remember in early high school reading books about American decline. And, hinge moments.
You were a 12-year-old Reaganite. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, I was a 12-year-old Reaganite, son of McGovernite parents. So the little rebel. And hinge moments in history are often only apparent in hindsight, of course. And it really is dramatic. And this is what I talk about in the essay. If you took the 12 years leading up to 1981 and then fast forward the 12 years after 1981, the difference in the United States, the American standing in the world, the sense of American optimism, the sense of American power, the actual reality of American power almost could not be more different. And I thought one of the things that really stood out to me, and I'll stop filibustering about the speech, was not just, there's sort of the standard, Reagan skepticism of government, but one of the things that Reagan said in the speech, and reading here a quote, "Now, so there will be no misunderstanding. It's not my intention to do away with government. It is rather to make it work.
Yeah.
Work with us, not over us, to stand by our side, not ride on our back. Government can and must provide opportunity, not smother it, foster productivity, not stifle it." And I feel like that captures a key aspect of the Reagan revolution to follow. It wasn't a minimalist government that presided, over the executive branch of the United States over the next 8 years, but it was a far more competent government. It was a government that did in fact fulfill this promise in many material ways. It did actually work. And I think that is one of the things as we're thinking about the next several years of American history. Can we rediscover competence? Can we actually make this thing work?
Right. Matt, so the address that you write about couldn't have happened in more different circumstances, as David fast forwarded to the next decade, but we only have to go 4 years later to find a profound change in the national mood at the time of the Second Inaugural, correct?
Yes, I think that's right. And if you look at the First Inaugural as perhaps a template for Joe Biden's inaugural tomorrow, then you would see the Second Inaugural, Reagan's Second Inaugural, as a template, the speech that Biden might like to give 4 years from now if he has a successful first term. The funny thing about Reagan's Second Inaugural was he wanted to go big, or at least his speechwriters wanted to go big. And yet the speech has a lot of flourishes of rhetoric, but it doesn't have quite the detail of that first inaugural address. And so one lesson I took from my study of these two speeches in preparation for this essay was that public rhetoric, which is so important, it needs to be lyrical, it needs to be memorable, but it also needs to be attached to an agenda, a very specific agenda. And that was, I think, present in the first inaugural and missing in the second.
I have a question. You note in your essay, and it's something that many of us have probably noted too, that Reagan didn't include the text of the Second Inaugural in Speaking My Mind, his anthology of speeches that he released in 1989. Why was that? Did he not like it?
Well, I think there was a sense of disappointment among the Reagan team about the Second Inaugural Address. The circumstances of the speech are really quite interesting when you begin to study them. Reagan didn't pay much attention to the Second Inaugural during the transition period between the first and second administrations. He was distracted. He had a lot going on, specifically in his cabinet, a lot of famous personages leaving, like Jeane Kirkpatrick, and then, of course, the major switch in jobs between his Treasury Secretary and his Chief of Staff. He also had visits from overseas, And so he seemed to be preoccupied that he doesn't mention it, this speech, the Second Inaugural, in his diary until just a couple weeks before he actually delivers it. And meanwhile, when you read the memoirs, say, of Peggy Noonan, who took a big hand in the writing of the Second Inaugural, she came away as frustrated as well, not only by Reagan's lack of attention, but also she felt that the speech never quite achieved what the team wanted it to. So I think those are reasons that Reagan didn't include it in Speaking My Mind, which was the anthology of his speeches, which he selected himself and actually introduced. It's a wonderful book for anyone who has access to it. And instead, he actually included a speech he gave to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, a few months later. And he says in Speaking My Mind that speech, the CPAC speech, actually explained what he wanted to achieve in his second term much better than the Second Inaugural Address. And I think the reason for that is exactly what I said earlier, which is that the CPAC address had much more meat on the bones. Yeah. It had the Reaganite rhetoric, but it also had, here's what I want to do and how we're going to do it, which is essential to any good speech, I think.
I just wanted to read a little snippet from Peggy Noonan's What I Saw at the Revolution, which you quote in your essay, which clearly frustrated by Reagan's lack of attention to the drafts. She writes, "I was just wondering if it's not unusual that the President of the United States appears to be taking no interest in his inauguration address." David, you say something not quite similar, but you say something in your essay. You say of his first inaugural, and I quote, "It wasn't his most memorable speech."
Right.
And how so? Tell us why.
Well, when you think of when I start the essay, I think of there are these moments of Reagan rhetoric, the very blunt, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. My favorite is the when the Challenger blew up and the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. I mean, that's powerful. Those words are powerful. They're memorable. This one, the first inaugural, to me, when you go back and I remember as I was starting this project, I was thinking, I don't remember anything about the first inaugural as sort of an amateur student of the Reagan presidency. It was not one that stood out in my mind. And as I went back and I watched it again and I read it again, it was pretty clear to me why. It felt a lot more like just a statement of declaration of purpose, a declaration of principles. It was not the kind of soaring, inspiring rhetoric that when you think of Ronald Reagan through the haze of history, that you identify with him. It was here is what we are about. And if there's one thing that really kind of pulled out to me, and again, maybe a lot of this is colored by the present crisis and the present moment that we're in. There seemed to be this fundamental assertion in this speech, this fundamental declaration, after all of these years, veering from crisis to crisis and failure to failure, that the American people had not failed. The American people had been failed, which I think is a very critical declaration about sort of what Ronald Reagan's view of the American people, view of the American government. The American soldier hadn't failed in Vietnam. I mean, he doesn't dive into all of this history, of course, in the inaugural. He had been failed. Mm-hmm. The American worker and the American consumer had not failed in being industrious enough and productive enough to have a healthy, vibrant economy. The structures around the consumer, the producer, had failed. And so he was gambling. He was saying that we can actually do by if we don't fail you, I know you won't fail us. And that seemed to be the bargain, that the gamble that he was, the roll of the dice was saying the failures of the last dozen years have not been of the American people. The failures of the last dozen years have been of American leadership.
So in many ways, it was a sort of self-explanatory speech, wasn't it? And maybe the burden of explanation was so great that rhetoric and flourishes wouldn't necessarily have sit quite so well with what he was trying to achieve. Whereas by the second inaugural, he'd graduated from self-explanatory president to rhetorical president. Is that a fair way of seeing things, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's a persuasive explanation. I also think, and I love David's essay, I also think when he gave that first inaugural, we have to remember the tenuousness of Reagan's own political position, right? I mean, he won big, but it was nowhere near as big a margin as he won in 1984. There are a lot of inhibitions about Ronald Reagan. He was the oldest president to date. He was a creature of the conservative movement, right? And he had to present himself as an American statesman in the midst of compounding crises, as David pointed out, not only economic crises, but also foreign policy crises, the sense, as David said, of pervasive American decline. And I think that's why maybe the speech is understated. I have to say, when you think about Reagan's rhetoric and why maybe the first inaugural didn't spring to mind, well, it's because there's a lot of competition, right? I mean, beginning in 1964 with Reagan's public debut in October in his speech for Barry Goldwater, "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny." So from 1964 to his farewell address in 1989, you have speech after speech of Ronald Reagan communicating his principles in ways that capture the American imagination and which truly deserves study. And so in that first inaugural, I think he had to be a little bit more concrete. He had to be a little bit less poetic and more explanatory. By the time he gets to the second inaugural, when I read the second inaugural, the poetry is everywhere. And I think actually that almost excess of poetry helps explain some of the confusions and setbacks of Reagan's second administration.
It's almost as if, David, the first inaugural was framed as a sort of counterpoint to Carter's malaise speech.
Yeah, it does seem like that to me. I mean, this is, if you look at some of the rhetoric that sort of tries to soar, but it actually just kind of sounds like conventional political flattery of the public. But Reagan says you have every right to dream heroic dreams. Those who say that we are in a time when there are no heroes just don't know where to look. You can see heroes every day going in and out of factory gates. Others, a handful in number, produce enough food to feed all of us and then the world beyond. I mean, this is, on the one hand, this is kind of like when you have a politician flattering the audience. But on the other hand, coming as a counterpoint to that malaise speech, it does feel like, and a lot of the theme of Reagan's of the race against Carter, he's countering this narrative of decline, this narrative that there has been failure, that there has been weakness, and it's funny. It's really hard to, and I was just old enough to be really realizing, it's kind of like when you're raised as a kid and you're raised in an atmosphere where you feel like something's wrong, that something's just not quite right. And one of the interesting symptoms, I think, of how diminished we felt was the Miracle on Ice. Now, this is, a lot of you who don't remember this is the miracle of the American amateur, these collection of ragtag, not really ragtag, but, this collection of amateur hockey players who defeated the most powerful hockey team in the world, the Soviet hockey team. And there was a wave of delirious joy that swept through the United States when we won a hockey match. Now, right now we're used to, we roll into the Olympics and we just crushed the place. We're just used to, but this was, and it seemed like not just in the grand contest that you saw as the Warsaw Pact had overwhelming numbers, as the Ayatollah had humiliated the United States of America, as we were standing in line to get gas, and on these macro things, we felt like we were diminished, and also in the micro. In these smaller contests, we felt like we were losing and losing and losing. And that's the atmosphere that Reagan was stepping into.
I mean, it seems almost a sin for me to read out a few words from the Carter's malaise speech in a conversation about Reagan, but you quoted a few words that I think need to be spoken out, just so we understand what came after and what Reagan felt the need to respond to. Carter said, "The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is the crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation." I mean, that is just like a series of hammer blows of gloom.
It is.
Landing on the national psyche.
Well, and the reason why I say he's unfairly maligned a little bit is I think that he is diagnosing something that was there. Mm-hmm. There was, in fact, a crisis. There was a crisis in growing doubt and meaning. But what Reagan was identifying was that the crisis was something that had been inflicted upon the nation rather than growing from the spirit of coming from the spirit of the nation. And I think that that's a really crucial distinction. I mean, yeah, by 1979, there was an enormous sense of gloom. So to diagnose that, yes, that was there. But the source of the gloom, the reason for the gloom, I think Reagan was saying, again, you didn't fail, you were failed, and I will not fail you.
Yeah, I mean, you note in your essay that we have this last year had an annus horribilis, and what America had was a horrible decade, a decennium horribilis, if you like. I mean, Matt, so how did we go from decennium horribilis, post-malaise gloom, to the sort of jaunty rhetoric of January 1985?
I think the simplest explanation is Reagan's courage. And I'll explain it this way. One, Reagan had the courage to stand by Paul Volcker as Volcker put the American economy through the ringer in order to defeat the inflation, which was which was eating away at American, incomes, at American pensions.
The stagflation.
The stagflation, right? And especially in combination with the second shock, which was the unemployment and high energy prices from the late mid to late 70s.
So that's inflation with antlers.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So but even though, and as we talk about a mild reassessment of Carter, we don't want to get too far here. This is a Reagan Institute discussion. But as we have this mild reassessment of Carter, we should understand that Volcker was Carter's appointment. And right. Yet, as Volcker really stood by his war on inflation, Reagan resisted attempts to fire, rather resisted calls to fire him. So that's important. The other aspect in which Reagan had courage, well, one is he stuck with the supply side economic program, which at the time he came into office was still considered marginal, still considered something almost fringe. But he had campaigned on it and he stuck with it. And the lower tax rates, once they finally kicked into effect in 1983 fully, were a major part of the economic renaissance. And then in the foreign policy, I say Reagan's courage. Reagan liked to joke, when they said toward the end of his first term, why haven't you met with the Soviet premier? And he'd like to say, well, they keep dying on me. And it's true. There was a lot of tumult among the Soviet leadership in his first 4 years in office. But at the same time, Reagan was very hard line in his attitude toward the Soviets. And specifically, I say courage because of the way he stood up against the nuclear freeze movement. Again, as David mentioned, things we forget about, like the Miracle on Ice. We forget about the nuclear freeze movement in the early part of Reagan's first administration and how massive it was. 1 million people marching in New York City for a complete freeze on nuclear weapons development and also deployment in Europe. And Reagan resisted it. He'd followed through on the ideas that he had been developing himself and in concert with conservative intellectuals. for decades. And so it was the implementation of those ideas, also important in our current context, within a structure of like-minded individuals, right? Capable people who understood what Reagan wanted and took direction from him, but were competent and credible in carrying out that vision. That brought us to the point in 1984 where Reagan just basically rolled over Walter Mondale. And even that, in retrospect, looks a little bit easier than it was at the time. Reagan started off in 1983, the pundits believed, as a sure loser. And even in 1984, after Reagan had that horrible first debate with Mondale, there was kind of an anxiety, the same anxiety with Reagan. It's like, is he really up to the job, right? And of course, as always, Reagan uses his way with words, his genial manner, and his sense of humor to deflate that anxiety in the second debate, when he said he would not make an issue out of his opponent's youth and inexperience.
So a lot of the things that came to be celebrated as kind of Reagan's signature policies by the time of his second inaugural, the tax cuts, the ratcheting up of pressure on the evil empire, were, David, at the time of his first inaugural, all very hotly contested policies, were they not? They weren't the sort of slam dunk things that we came to see them as.
Oh, they were in many ways they were seen as reckless. The nuclear freeze movement made and I'm so glad you brought that up, because again, this was a mass international movement that essentially had this very simple message. Well, how many nuclear weapons do you need exactly? So he was considered reckless. He was considered dangerous. An awful lot of Americans, for example, in 1983, when KAL 007 was shot down, this is the Korean airliner shot down over the Soviet Union. People were immediately seized with a fear that we might actually go to war. A lot of policies that in hindsight seem, oh yeah, that was going to work, such as the defense buildup, such as and it wasn't just a defense buildup. In many ways, it was a transformation of American military doctrine. It was a big bet on a whole bunch of new weapon systems that we still use today. When I served in Iraq, I served with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the two major platforms that we used were the M1 Abrams tank and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, both developed and rolled out during the Reagan administration at scale. So this was a comprehensive doubling down, not just on a controversial economic idea. It was a doubling down on a very controversial military and strategic idea, and also the beginning of the end of containment and the idea that you could roll back Soviet advances, the investment in, and it's funny, again, how history colors our view. Until 9/11, the view from the United States was that our investment in the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was one of the most crystal clear foreign policy successes in decades. And then, of course, the fact that the Mujahideen never entirely went away, and we know the history that followed. But this was something that drained Soviet energy. It drained Soviet will, and the war in Afghanistan. So there were a lot of things that he did that were deemed at the time extraordinary gambles, and time and time again they paid off. And sort of the crowning moment.
And they were gambles in a way. I mean, they were.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. It was not really until the George H.W. Bush administration that sort of the final evidence of the validity of the theories began to emerge. I mean, when the sudden falling of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, and then this sort of, people forget, before Desert Storm, this was the proof of concept of the entire American military buildup. And not only did the machinery function magnificently, the training was magnificent, and they rolled over all of this Soviet era equipment in a victory that shook Russian military planners, that they realized the inferiority of their position.
Matt, I'm going to ask you a question. You say something. You ascribe to Reagan's second inaugural, a quality that's very 21st century. You say the second inaugural was inclusive.
Mm.
Can you elaborate on that and what you?
Yeah, well, there's in the second inaugural, Reagan talks about almost a second American Revolution, and I think when he's speaking about this, what he means is he understood that the Reaganomics and the boom of the mid decades, which grew in the second half of the decade, had not filtered through the entire population. Reagan was very much aware of the fact that his relationship with the Black community was poor. And this, I think, hurt him deeply as someone who believed himself to be a committed anti-racist based on really his youth and his mother, Nell, teaching him not to be prejudiced against ethnic and racial minorities. And so when he's speaking, I call the speech inclusive because there are some gestures in that inaugural address, the second inaugural, to wanting to really incorporate African Americans into the Reagan Revolution. And you saw that a little bit with the proposal for enterprise zones and the influence of Jack Kemp, still in Congress at that time, as the bleeding heart conservative, as he called himself, someone who wanted really to have the Republican Party reestablish a connection with the Black community that had been missing for many years. So I admire that part of the second inaugural, even as we recognize that that job still is far from complete.
Which sort of dovetails with a point made by Ken Kachigian in a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, in which he talks about the small influence that Vernon Jordan had on the first inaugural, something I didn't know about, and I don't know if you did, David, in which he met Vernon Jordan at Katharine Graham's house at a dinner in Washington before his inaugural, and he made some changes to his speech in response
Interesting
to prompts from Vernon Jordan.
Oh, I did not know that. I'm glad we brought this up, because I think it if you came of age as a young conservative in the Reagan era, in the moving into Bush 1, you came of age in a time in which there was a lot of, and centered around Jack Kemp, for example, a lot of intellectual energy around the idea that conservatism and conservative ideas could dramatically close economic and achievement gaps and could be the absolute key to closing at least somewhat of the racial gap in American voting. I remember sitting in law school. This is right at the end of the Reagan in beginning of Bush, and sitting in law school and hearing from Jack Kemp with this incredible energy and passion about how these ideas that had worked so well to transform the American economy, had worked so well to increase American prosperity overall, were also, if more precisely targeted, were going to do an enormous amount of good in closing achievement gaps and wealth and income and education between white and Black. And so there was this real sense amongst a certain layer of the conservative movement that there was real hope to end a lot of sort of the extremely sort of race-based block voting, that there could be a real kind of outreach. And I think that energy and that spirit that existed by the late 80s, and not universally, of course, but in a very important segment of American conservatism, is something that we need to recapture now. And we're seeing some of it. We're seeing some of it actually in some of the prison reform that you see is springing out of, in many states, conservative state legislatures working with African-American activists. For example, one of the leading states in the union for prison reform has been Texas, which shocks a lot of people. That we need to rediscover that energy around bringing conservative ideas into historically marginalized communities, and saying these are ways to bridge longstanding gaps and ways to increase prosperity and increase opportunity into communities that have been too long denied prosperity and denied opportunity.
Matt, how does, not necessarily tying what David's just said into my question, but I was intrigued in reading your essay in your by your emphasis on a phrase that Reagan used, which is the American sound. There's this sort of motif in his speech, which isn't entirely clear, and I think you acknowledge in your essay that it's a phrase with no immediately apparent meaning. You do try to tease some meaning out of it. How does that? What did he mean by that, and how does that relate to the way we conduct ourselves today and going forward? The American sound.
Yeah, that phrase did strike me as the most memorable of the Second Inaugural, and yet it's also a phrase that's complicated in a lot of ways, because with speeches, you often think of visual metaphors, right? Or the sound of a speech is in kind of the poesy of the rhetoric. Here, Reagan is attributing a sound to an entire nation, a nation of hundreds of millions of people of various views and histories, and a very disagreeable nation. It's always been a very disagreeable nation. And so what does the American sound actually mean? And as Reagan illustrates it, he uses multiple examples, and so how can all these different individuals be saying the same thing? So this is one of the things that I thought made the speech a little bit less effective than some of the other gems in the Reagan rhetorical jewel box. But when I finished my essay, it occurred to me that if there is such a thing as the American sound, it was coming from Reagan himself. Reagan gave it voice, and it kind of relates to some of the points that David has been making, which is this idea that Reagan had. It was a twofold idea. One, America is a special place. That America is put on earth to decide the fate of freedom in the world, right? This is something he seems to have caught on from a book he read in the 50s, and he really truly believed that America was exceptional, and that this was where the fate of humankind would be decided. The second part of that idea is that the American people were right, that they were right, and that you needed to listen to them. And Reagan, has been described as a populist. He's a populist, a very unusual populist, because he's a populist without scapegoats. A lot of populists say that the people have been aggrieved by X, and X can be bankers, X can be minorities, X can be financiers. The people have been aggrieved by X. And what Reagan did was basically say, the X isn't a group of people. It's a thing. It's this thing called big government. It's this big government that is removed from you. It's thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. It's an enclosure. Everybody thinks alike, which I can attest to, living and working there. And that's the problem. And so Reagan said to the American people, your instincts are correct. The problem is that the government has gotten it wrong. And so that meant that Reagan found it his responsibility to basically voice what the American people thought and wanted. And that might include policies, right? But it also included this more fundamental understanding of the nation as the only country up to the point when it was created that said that the people were the master of government, not the other way around. That's the key to one of the keys to Reaganism, in my view. And it's something that comes out in all of these speeches, but also with this evocation of the American sound in the Second Inaugural.
And of course, the Second Inaugural, as you write, was very well received in the media, even in unlikely quarters such as the New York Times. Maybe you could tell me why, and then David, perhaps dwell briefly on how the first inaugural was received, and after that, I'll turn to the questions that I have from some members of the audience.
Sure. Yeah. As Peggy Noonan says in her memoir, the press saved the speech. Like I said at the outset, the team was not very pleased with the text of the Second Inaugural, but the reviews were pretty favorable. And part of that, I think, has to do with the unusual circumstances in which the Second Inaugural was delivered, in some ways similar to the very unusual circumstances of the inauguration tomorrow. One was the location changed. It was so bitterly cold on the day that Reagan would be sworn in that they canceled the parade, they canceled the outdoor ceremony, and Reagan actually delivered his inaugural from within the Capitol rotunda. And so the problem, though, was that the speechwriters hadn't made that change to the text. And so when Reagan was delivering his second inaugural address, he says, as we stand here out on the steps of the Capitol, and he caught himself, right? And he said, or he would have been if it weren't so cold. And the whole crowd broke into laughter. And what's funny about Peggy Noonan's telling of this story is that she thinks, and she's probably right, that Reagan had seen this mistake before he went to deliver the speech. But he knew that it would make a great joke. And so he left it in there and did it anyway. And once again, Reagan's use of humor immediately turns the crowd, including the press, to him. They come onto his side, and that's how this speech was saved in the end.
There's nothing so scripted as improvisation.
Well, he was a great actor, and he had many years of studying how to incorporate an ad lib so that it looks like it was it hadn't been planned.
David, what about the first? How is that received?
Well, one of the fascinating things about the first is that he's giving a speech in the midst of the unfolding denouement of the Iranian hostage crisis. And so the speech itself is happening right alongside a momentous event in American foreign policy at the moment, right alongside the end of a crisis that had just plagued Jimmy Carter. And so, one of the things I think that's interesting about that first inaugural moment is it was kind of almost immediately overshadowed by this return of the hostages. As far as an overall reception, there was just huge skepticism of this guy. He was viewed in elite circles as a very dangerous man.
Right.
He was viewed as very dangerous. And so you're talking about somebody who's walking in who has as was said earlier, he's an older president. He has ideas that are untested and untried. He is coming in the immediate denouement of a massive foreign policy crisis. To say that there was skepticism in sort of the elite media ranks and the academic ranks is an understatement. And he was marking a change in many ways, and a course correction in many ways when people felt like the danger, particularly of the Soviet Union, was at its most acute. It's really hard to describe. Again, I keep saying this, it's hard to describe the mindset at the time. The sense that the Soviet Union was overwhelmingly powerful was pervasive. This is going to sound strange to people who didn't grow up in this era, but you could go into a bookstore and you would see book after book after book comparing NATO and the Warsaw Pact. How many tanks one had, how many nuclear weapons, how many aircraft, the quality of the aircraft. I mean, this was just stuff that was, if you're a kid growing up, you could have a stack full of books over just analyzing all of the military disparities, all of the power disparities. And there was this sense that they are of overwhelming strength and we don't have good options. And the one thing we should not do is be provocative. That is the one thing that we should not do. And so here comes a guy who believes in American strength, believes in confronting the Soviet Union, believes in, as we've discussed, economic ideas that were scorned, not just sort of people are skeptical about, were scorned, and coming in this time of national crisis. And so, look, if you're going to talk about sort of a elite media and academic reaction, it's taken years after the end of his second term for some folks to even give him grudging.
Yes, yes.
Even give him grudging credit for some of the undeniable achievements.
Well, thanks. I'm going to turn to some of these questions that we've received, and I'll start with the shortest since it's the easiest one to read out, and I'll expect an answer from both of you, unless you choose not to answer it. Are inaugural addresses a reliable indicator of a new president's true priorities? Is the question.
I would say yes. I actually think inaugural addresses are a great X-ray into what a president believes and what he wants to do. Look at the first inaugural, right? Government is not the solution, right? I mean, we're gonna be harder on the Soviets. We are going to unleash the productive forces of the American economy through tax and spending cuts. He did that. Look at George Bush's second inaugural address. It is our policy of the United States to combat tyranny to the end and increase democracy. And that what explained Bush's commitment to seeing the Iraq War to some type of stable resolution, and also his efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East and abroad in his second term. Look at Donald Trump's inaugural. There was definitely a message there about what he thought had happened, what had brought America to that point, and what he was going to do over the next 4 years. So I think inaugural addresses are definitely very useful in seeing what a president thinks of the state of the nation and what he wants to do over the course of his term.
David?
Well, I'd almost just want to incorporate that entire answer, especially the reference.
You can say I concur.
Yeah, I concur, especially the reference to the second inaugural from Bush. I thought that was one of the clearest statements of presidential intent, presidential worldview, sort of even a view of humanity that we've seen in some time. And in that way, I feel like the first inaugural for Reagan was, again, such a clear statement of intent, such a clear statement of worldview. And with Biden's inaugural coming up, it would shock me if we heard anything other than the themes of his election, which were he's going to try to be a unifying figure. He's going to try to be a figure of healing. Now, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to be that kind of figure. I mean, he's got a lot of folks on his left flank who want to accomplish very specific things. You're walking into a very different media and cultural environment than existed in 1981, or even, of course, 2004, or many of the other previous inaugurals. But I do think that we will hear the statement of presidential intent tomorrow as a healing and unifying effort. But again, whether a president can fulfill the statement of intent is something that will remain, we remain to see.
I have another question. It's prefaced by some remarks in which it said, it's no secret that the Republican Party is divided today, and some of those advocating for a change in the GOP's orthodoxy, in quotes, talk about the need to move away from, quotes, zombie Reaganism. Is the Republican Party moving away from the Reagan legacy? And do you expect GOP politicians to invoke Reagan less frequently going forward? Maybe you can start, David, if you like it.
I mean, I think we will see politicians invoke Reagan less frequently. I think the phrase zombie Reaganism is often a stand-in for kind of a straw man, to be honest. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many. I mean, of course, there are legacies and influences, ideological influences from Reagan. But a lot of it is just sort of boiled down to kind of a straw man-ish, muscular military abroad and tax cuts at home, which is there's a lot of people who, haven't seen an economic problem that a tax cut couldn't handle. I mean, there's some folks like that, but a lot of this is straw man argument. I mean, when you go back and you look at history, one of the things I thought that Matthew said that was very powerful was he was a populist without a boogeyman. So he connected with that longstanding populist side of the right that does exist, that will exist, that has existed, but he did so in a particular way, the populist without the boogeyman, which I think was a way to sort of channel the frustration that something is wrong without creating the toxic energy that we see all around us. He was also somebody, and I'm going to go back to this. He was good at his job. As far as he was very good as a head of state. He was very effective as a head of government. And again, these are different things. He was very good as a chief executive, and he was very good as a head of state. And so that rediscovery of sort of just basic competence, this was an aspect of Reaganism as well. So when I hear that phrase zombie Reaganism, it's sometimes hard for me to take it as, oh, this is a really considered opinion about who and what Reagan was. This is sort of a side swipe at a certain view of tax cuts or foreign policy. But look, the world is just different. I mean, it's hard to divorce Reaganism from the challenge of the Cold War. I mean, this is something that shaped Reaganism deeply, and so we're not in a similar kind of global situation. So there are going to be limited applications of some aspects of Reaganism, but then other aspects of Reaganism I think are quite salient, and I really, really love that formulation of what Reaganite populism is or was, and that's something that can be quite relevant today.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. And I guess I would approach it this way. Ronald Reagan was the most successful Republican president of the 20th century. He's one of the most successful presidents ever. Very rare do you have a president to serve two full terms and then hand it over to his successor of the same party. This rarely happens. And it's a demonstration, I think, of that president's success and staying power. So because he's the most successful Republican president of the 20th century, and because there hasn't been a Republican president in the 21st century who has matched that success or that popularity, I do think we're going to see Republican candidates try to invoke the spirit of Reagan for some time. Look, Joe Biden is becoming president tomorrow. He's being likened, or people try to nudge him to resemble FDR. FDR, the most successful Democratic president in the nation's history. His presidency ended much long before Reagan's did, and Democrats are still looking to him. So I wouldn't be surprised if Republicans continue to look to Reagan for decades to come. I would say this, though. I think Reaganism is fundamentally understood because it's not so much policies, it's a worldview. And the way I would sum up that worldview is this. Human beings are, individual human beings are uniquely precious. They need to flourish. The way that they flourish is by people allowing them to choose their own destiny and not imposing obstacles in their way. And this chief agent of those obstacles, in Reagan's view, was big government. And so government's job was to move aside and let individuals and their enterprises and their associations just develop on their own. Reagan also had a funny view of history. You know, he was a conservative. He was a major part of the American conservative movement, but he thought he was a progressive. He thought progress was the unleashing of entrepreneurial energies. If you go back to the speech he delivered to the students at Moscow State University in his visit in 1988, his vision of the future and progress is innovation, entrepreneurship, creativity. He thought he was the progressive. He thought the reactionaries, as he said often in his speeches, especially in the beginning of his career, the reactionaries were the people who would turn to, as he put it, the failed ideologies of the 19th century, meaning socialism, right? And then the other way to think about Reaganism is, Reagan often said that there is no left or right, there's only up or down. So the axes on which politics operates were very different for Reagan than for the rest of us. Up to the maximum individual freedom with social order, right? And then down to the ash heap of control and totalitarianism. If you want to be a Reaganite, that's what you need to believe. And then you take those beliefs and you think, okay, how do they apply to the challenges facing today? And as Reagan would say, there are no easy answers, but there are simple answers. And Reagan was very good at taking a problem and simplifying it to its essence, and then relating that essence to the American people in order to build public support for his agenda.
I think we have time for one last question. And the question is phrased as follows. I've heard it said, says the questioner, that President Reagan was not called the Great Communicator simply because he was an effective speaker, but because he was truly in communion with the American people. What is your reflection on this? David?
I like that. I like that that formulation. I think he understood the American people. He understood the nation that he led. And I'm going to go back to something I said earlier about the distinction between a head of state and a chief executive. The chief executive is the person who is pulling the levers of power. He's directing resources. He's formulating strategy. He's developing tactics. He's implementing policy. The head of state has in many ways has a cultural role, has an a role of inspiring, of motivating, of in some ways can creating an emotional / spiritual connection with a people. So
like the Queen of England.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the great examples of that in the last year, we're on the same wavelength, was the Queen of England's address to the British people upon the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic, where she connected the present struggle with the great struggles of the past. That's being a head of state at a that's a head of state at her finest in that circumstance. He was so good at that, I think, in part because he understood America. And even in times of extreme crisis, when in the assassination attempt, when he came much closer to dying than any of us realized at the time in real time. And he kind of had this bit of bravado about him, even famously cracking jokes about the doctor. Look, it's entirely possible that's just the guy's personality coming out in a time of distress. And it's also possible that he's cognizant at all times he's president of the United States. And I think that connection that he had was a very powerful part of his appeal.
Do you want to add something to that before?
No, I think that's all right, and I just want to expand on that last part of what David said. This feeling among of Reagan's that he was always on stage, that he was always Ronald Reagan. And that's the communion. Is that he had a certain way of becoming the character, right? And the character was Ronald Reagan, and that character kind of moved through the 20th century. And it's fascinating at how continuous he was throughout it. You can look at his first real political interview in 1947 in a Hollywood gossip column. It's the same ideas that he gave in this first inaugural or in the farewell speech in 1989. And so the communion was, he was always present. He was always himself. And he wasn't going to let the inner turmoil of a personality dominate. He was going to play this role all the time. And he did it in such a way that it commanded, the love of a large portion of the country, even during his political career. And now today, as David was saying, it took about 20 years, but now even progressives are looking at Reagan and understanding him as one of America's most important statesmen.
Well, that's a good time at which to stop and to take stock. you've given us a wonderful portrait of President Reagan as a conservative who was also a progressive, a populist without scapegoats, a head of state and a head of government, a believer in competence, a believer in competent government above all, a government that in a sort of Hippocratic sense does no harm, gets out of the way, and ultimately a man who sought always to capture the American sound, whatever that may mean. We certainly know what this means, his own inimitable voice. So we look forward tomorrow to another inaugural address, and let us hope that it lives up to the excellence shown by President Reagan in 1981 and 1985. I think one thing we know for sure is that the reception that President Biden's address will receive from the media is likely to be favorable, irrespective of what he says, which perhaps is no bad thing in these times. On that note, thank you, David. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to the Reagan Institute for this opportunity to talk about history today, tomorrow, and the politics of the country that we love so much. Thank you.